In the process of the steering committee, there emerged a kind of a misconception, I thought, that nothing happened in Chapel Hill until 1964 and 1965. This is a profound misconception, that things really got rolling in 1959 with the Greensboro sit-ins, and it radiated to Chapel Hill almost immediately. So it was a great gift from my standpoint to have been in college at a time when there was this great social revolution beginning here in Chapel Hill and further in the South. It taught people the value of engagement in social issues, direct personal engagement, of moral witness to history, of a certain skepticism of authority, the value of confrontation, because the students here really were the vanguard of the civil rights desegregation movement here, melding with the high school, which was very important. And Lester Carson here will know more about this than I do. But I want to say one thing that also came out of the steering committee. This is not necessarily a panel about how glorious it was to be an activist. I would have ventured to say that the vast majority of the students at Chapel Hill perhaps had a kind of a vague awareness that this social revolution was happening around them, but they were not involved. There was a small minority of us that were very, very actively involved, but we should not forget those for whom the protest movement confronted their very basic Southern values, who were very deeply and passionately against what we were trying to accomplish here. So that anger and hate and passion was engaged in this struggle here on all parts of that, whether you were for the protest or were not involved or were against it. And that's what made being here exciting in 59 to 63. Now, we've got three very different points of view here that I hope will be very, very helpful. My old and dear friend Richard King is going to give us an overview of the situation connecting the Chapel Hill protest to the wider Southern desegregation movement. Richard got his PhD after leaving here from the UVA. He taught at the University of District of Columbia for a number of years and at Vanderbilt, and has ended up at the University of Nottingham in Britain, is focusing on American intellectual history and on Southern history. Jim Wallace here left, and in 1973, as a photographer, took over the post of being director and curator of imaging and photographic services at the Smithsonian Institution, where he managed the photographers for the Museum of American History, the Museum of Natural History, and the Air and Space Museum in Washington. That's a big management job, as he's continued on his photography throughout his life. The photographs that you will see around here evoke this era in a way that nothing else possibly could, and that how those photographs surfaced is a fascinating story in itself. And in retirement, he's still photographing. And where have you just been in Florida? And what kind of birds have you been photographing?
Marsh birds, wading birds, any kind of wildlife. Yes.
That's a Florida joke.
And to my immediate left here is Lester Carson, who I am just thrilled to have with us here today. Lester Carson is the sole African-American graduate of the class of 1963, that class of 1800. When he left here, he went to work at the New York World Telegram, stayed there until 1966, worked in other distinguished newspapers, Newsday and the AP, Black Enterprise, and then turned to academia for some reason or another. Went and began teaching journalism at Florida A&M and then at the University of Florida as an associate professor of journalism. We have with us his two daughters today, which is a real plus as well. His older daughter, Lynn, is an official at the U.S. Customs Service, and younger daughter, Lisa Nicole Carson, is an actress, has been in the movie Devil in the Blue Dress with Denzel Washington, and ER with Alec McBill. So,
Yeah, two different shows.
Two different shows, I mean,
Okay.
yeah. Right you are. So, Richard, why don't you start us off?
Okay, thanks, Jim. I think like everybody, it's you're apprehensive before a reunion, and then suddenly you get there and the time goes fast and things melt into indescribable and indiscernible movements from person to person and back and forth. It's a real pleasure and honor to be able to talk just for, I think Jim will give me the hook, about 10 minutes, a bit about the overall framework within which we can understand what went on in Chapel Hill, 1963 to the middle of 1964, with a prefacing set of actions and activities beginning in 1960. Jim was right. When the sit-ins in Greensboro break out in February 1960, Chapel Hill is one of the first places to feel the first waves, and that movement triggered off other protests across the South. What I want to do today is first of all try to describe not so much the civil rights movement. I think it is a unified movement. And in the period 1954, as Walter Dellinger so eloquently described it yesterday, Brown versus Board of Education, to roughly 1968, Martin Luther King's assassination. That's a kind of classic civil rights era or movement. But historians and students of the phenomena now want to move it back into the 1940s and 30s. The long civil rights movement is one way it's expressed, and bring it up past the late 1960s and include the North, the movement North in the development. So the definition itself, the civil rights movement, its range is problematic in a good sense. There's creative thinking all along, and there's a huge amount. And I just want to mention one book by Taylor Branch, a 3-volume book, Parting of the Waters, America in the Age of King. And he's a UNC graduate. It's kind of the best single overall account of these years from a certain perspective. But what I want to do is outline four perspectives or narratives that interweave to make up the movement. That is, in some sense, I'm saying there's civil rights movements that need to be picked out and then put back together. The first one is the one Walter Dellinger covered yesterday so wonderfully, and that is the concern with desegregation primarily of the schools. And this grew out of the Brown decision, which was about school desegregation. It didn't say segregation is unconstitutional in general. It specifically addressed the issue of schools. And you might call this the narrative or the story of from Brown versus Board of Education 1954 to Bakke, the decision in the late 1970s, affirming affirmative action on the part of the Supreme Court in a modified form. And the issues in this struggle, civil rights struggle, are mainly at the national level and in the courts. Now, this level fades in importance in beginning with the sit-ins in 1960s. That is, there's a second narrative or story that you might call from Greensboro to, well, I was trying to think of an alliterative conclusion, wasn't able to find it, but from Greensboro to Lowndes County, Alabama, that is this is the more activist phase of the movement, and involves primarily students, or the students are at the vanguard of this movement. Black college students, and in the case of Mississippi Freedom Summer in 1964, black and white students from the North. The focus here was not on desegregating schools, but was on desegregating public facilities, so-called public accommodations, then direct action to organize communities, and community organizing is incredibly important in this. This moves it from leadership inspired to grassroots. And the focus, particularly in Mississippi and the Deep South, was voter registration. Now, keep coming back to this matter of importance of voter registration, but let me just say ahead, the one big difference between the movement here in Chapel Hill and in the Deep South was there was no issue about voter registration. There had been no systematic disfranchisement of black vote in Orange County or anywhere in central North Carolina or Piedmont, North Carolina. So there's some significant differences here. The best known of the narratives or stories of the movement, of course, is what you might call, following Eli Landau's film title, From Montgomery to Memphis, and that's the story of the King-led aspect of the movement, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, religiously oriented, nonviolent direct action from principle, not strategy or tactics. That is, there was a belief in nonviolent direct action here. So the student movement tended fairly quickly to keep with nonviolence as a tactical or strategic move rather than a matter of deep principle. The King-led movement stayed with that principle. And the King movement acted through arriving in a community, leading demonstrations and marches, and then leaving, which subjected them to a lot of criticism from the students, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the SNCC people, for hit and run tactics. So there are tensions within the movement between these narratives, between these organizations. Now I think the fourth one is the movement out of the South. You might say it begins with the shocking, I think it was one of the most shocking things, perhaps as much as Brown in the context, of the Watts riots in 1965. When, not in the South, but in the West, and already in Rochester and Brooklyn earlier in 64, there had been summers of civil disorder, disturbance, and Watts was the thing that was a shot across the bow to the movement, that it wasn't getting to whole sectors of the African American population in the country. That it was no longer, after that, just a Southern movement. So there's a shift geographically as well as in terms of programs and tactics. What the issues here become ones of not nonviolent at all, more emphasis upon social and economic issues, and what we now call identity politics. The matter of black identity is on the agenda in an explicit way in this fourth strand of the late civil rights movement into black power, that represents a whole shift in the orientation of things. So these are the four strands, dimensions, stories, narratives that I would see as making up and the civil rights movement. Now, where does the Chapel Hill events fit in? Well, I've already indicated in one sense, it's obviously the movement here, or early stages of movement get going because there's picketing of both movie theaters, restaurants downtown in 1960 and 61. It begins a little more intensely in the spring of 1963, and Jim has photographs in his book of that, with a large march, I believe in May of 1963. And then in the summer, the movement in Chapel Hill gets going in earnest. And its primary focus is upon desegregation of public accommodations, primarily restaurants and places of eating and so on. So the movement in Chapel Hill belongs in the category of the student movement. It's importantly led and manned by students in part, and direct action in terms of sit-ins. Okay, so that's one thing. The second thing is, though, that as I mentioned a minute ago, and I want to underline, the main thrust of the movement in general shifts after the early 60s, from 1960 on, from Greensboro, the sit-in movement, to the Deep South. If you look at the story from the story of Montgomery to Memphis, you see Albany, Georgia, Birmingham, Alabama, Freedom Summer in Mississippi, summer of '64, Lowndes County, Alabama, the organization of the first, and I always think the more authentic, Black Panther Party in Lowndes County in '65, '66. So this shift of action in what is identified as the civil rights movement happens fairly soon away from North Carolina. In that sense, the movement here gets caught not as a backwater, but as a kind of side movement. One other thing doesn't happen here, and that is that there's no national focus through a national organization. The organization that was organizing, if anyone was from the outside in Chapel Hill, was CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, the oldest protest movement, deep roots in Fellowship of Reconciliation, A.J. Muste, pacifism. Bayard Rustin, the great black leader, came through here and was arrested in 1947 on the first Freedom Ride. What happened in 1961 was the precursor was in 1947 when Rustin and others were arrested here. So CORE was behind, through the person of Floyd McKissick, who was one of the 4 first law students at UNC Law School in 1951, Floyd McKissick, but his superior in CORE, James Farmer, came here but never made it a matter of a kind of national campaign. So that's another way in which the movement here was both connected with the larger movement through CORE, through strategy and tactics, but didn't become part of the main show. An irony is, and I'm coming to the last couple of points, an irony is that the Public Accommodations Act, which was passed in July 1964, that is against desegregation of public accommodations and facilities and everything, basically killed the movement here, because all its eggs were in that basket of desegregating restaurants and public accommodations. When the federal law is passed, the protests become moot. There isn't another dimension to the movement here of voter registration or community organizing that could carry on after the Public Accommodations Act. So a kind of irony, it's killed by the national success of the Public Accommodations Bill in July of '64. Now, Jim Lester will be talking about the more personal experience. The final thing is, those of you particularly from around here in North Carolina, I think there's a direct connection, and historians will have to do more with this, and this does need work by historians. There's a direct connection between the movement here and the passage in June of 1963 of the speaker ban by the North Carolina State Assembly. Some of you may have heard Bob Spearman earlier back in April. I'd just gotten here, but he spoke about the speaker ban and the politics behind it and everything, and it's fairly clear it was a reaction in large part, to what had gone on in Chapel Hill during '63 into '64. I think I better stop there, but I hope it gives you some framework in which Jim and Lester's remarks and make sense, and we can talk more about some of these, and you all can fill in some of the gaps too. Thanks a lot.
Terrific. Thank you so much. I was remiss in not saying in introducing Jim Wallace that these extraordinary photographs are encapsulated in a book called Courage in the Moment, Civil Rights Struggle, 1961-64. These photographs are going to be part of the permanent exhibition of the Museum of African American History in Washington on the mall when it opens up in a year or two. The Bull's Head Bookshop has got 72 copies of this, I was told. And Jim Wallace says he'd be glad to hang around here if you want to run over there and get a copy and get him to sign it.
Thank you, sir. All of the photographs, and I encourage you when this is over with to come up and look at the photographs. First off, each and every one of these photographs were taken for the Daily Tar Heel. They did not all appear in the Daily Tar Heel because you'll recall we only did 4 pages. Advertising took up basically 1 page, editorials 1 page, sports half a page, and so we only had the front page. But beginning with Wayne King in 1961, who was the editor of the Tar Heel and later went on to win a Pulitzer Prize and be nominated for 2 more, Wayne felt it important for the Daily Tar Heel to cover what was going on in the civil rights movement downtown. And his reasoning was, and the staff agreed, and I must also note that the staff at that time was basically under 15 people, was that if we had students on campus, black students, who were not able to cross Franklin Street with us and be able to go to any movie theater or be able to eat in any restaurant, that was something that the Tar Heel should be concerned with. And Wayne was followed by Jim Clotfelter, who actually sent a reporter to Ole Miss when James Meredith was trying to be admitted there, who was tear gassed. Mike Putzel later made a name for himself by being the AP correspondent at the White House. Is anyone here who was on the Tar Heel at that time? Well, good. Nobody can correct me. The other thing, following up what James said in the introduction, is that all of these photographs were shot in 1963 or before. There's no 1964 photographs in here. So following up the comment that many people felt that there wasn't much going on between 61 and 63, all of this happened during that time period. After I graduated, and I didn't do a very good job, I was probably the worst student to ever leave Chapel Hill because I spent so much time on the Tar Heel. And I think I was here for 3 summer sessions and graduated at the end of the second summer session in 1964, excuse me. But it was a very worthwhile thing to do. You will see in the book there's photographs of a Ku Klux Klan rally. They actually sent us a news release saying they were having a recruiting rally and it was going to be at the intersection of State Road 86 and Interstate 85 just outside of Hillsborough. Mickey Blackwell, who was also on the paper and now, by the way, is the head of the Baptist Children's Homes of North Carolina, Mickey and I went, why they let me photograph the way they did. I am, excuse me, not totally certain, but when they asked who we were and I told them my name was Jim Wallace, there was another Wallace who was the governor of Alabama at that time. And I did nothing to dissuade them that,
kinfolk.
Yes, that you know, if they did anything bad to me, my Uncle George was going to come and haunt them. By the way, I also, and working with some of the people, James Farmer and others, he wanted to know what my full name was, and I said James Henry Wallace Jr. Well, one of Roosevelt's vice presidents was Henry Wallace, who was something of a leftist-leaning fellow, and I think he believed that I was related to someone on the other side of the fence, and I played it for anything I could in order to get the photographs that you see here and in the book. I was at the Smithsonian for 29 years. It was a wonderful thing, and I will mention first off that the Greensboro lunch counter, a section of it is in the National Museum of American History. It will be in the new National Museum of African American History and Culture, which is now under construction and will open shortly. The photographs were sort of wrapped up. The darkroom was in Gray Memorial in the basement, and they sort of a 35 millimeter film just got rolled up, and it was not until, frankly, after I retired from the Smithsonian 10 years ago that I went in and found the photographs and cut them and sleeved them, and I was recovering from a medical problem that wasn't terribly serious, but it prevented me from getting out and moving around a whole lot, and so I scanned and cut and spotted the photographs. I would also like to mention that one of the photographs was just obtained by the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis at the former Lorraine Motel where Dr. King was shot, and one will be there. There is one photograph about half the size of one of these wall sections in the museum in Raleigh, in the North Carolina State Museum. And this picture, one of my pictures from the Civil Rights March in 1963 in Washington, is in the Museum of American History at this time. But at any rate, I've been a longtime member of the National Press Club, and I did an exhibit after I had scanned these photographs. And basically, the prints that are here are the ones that were on display at the National Press Club, together with a few others. One of the executives from Dover Publishing happened to see them, and the next thing we knew, we had this book. I must mention that the marches, by and large, started up near Carrboro from St. Joseph's CME Church, which is, of course, still there. And in fact, St. Joseph's, one of the parishioners there, Mrs. Jackson, donated some money to form the Jackson Center, which has been organized to save the history of the church and to also continue to do community building and in particular education. And so they have a set of my photographs up there, and the reason that I presented them to them was that when we were putting the book together almost 2 years ago, I wanted to get more names. And I had the names of some of the white people, but I didn't have many of the names of the black people in the sit-ins and whatnot. And so we went to my wife and I went up to St. Joseph's on a Sunday. They had an open house. They invited parishioners from all of the churches that they could find, and people came in and walked through tables, and they'd circle faces and write names. That was also where I got the subtitle for the book, because it was originally Courage in the Moment, the Civil Rights Movement, 1961 to 64. And I noticed on several occasions younger people up at St. Joseph's, and younger people now to me has to be defined as anyone under 50, would come up to some of the older parishioners and they would say, what were you doing during the struggle? And they were specifically calling it the struggle. And so that is how the subtitle. We have been up at St. Joseph's several times. Last November, I was in this room doing a Hutchins lecture, And that weekend, the Jackson Center and St. Joseph's Church had their 40th to 50th anniversary of the civil rights marches and the civil rights movement. And I actually got to meet and talk with some of the people who you see in these photographs, which was a really neat weekend. I just got a email literally last night from the woman who is one of the directors up at the Jackson Center. They have been working with high school students, and they have been using these photographs so that they understand what it was that their parents and grandparents did so that they could eat at any restaurant in town, go to any movie theater. You will note in these photographs that you see largely the pictures are of women and teenagers or even children. That was because many of the black males, frankly, had been threatened with their jobs if they participated in the movement or the sit-ins or whatever. Chapel Hill was also different because there was little or no violence. And I found out from one of the pictures that you will see is outside of Brady's Restaurant, which is now a hotel site. And there's an officer there who is Lindy Pendergrass. If you're from this area, you'll know he's been the sheriff here now for about 20 years. Lindy let me inside the lines. I never knew why, but Lindy let me literally, there's one picture over here of somebody being carried into the jail, and I was inside the garage at the jail taking photographs. I never knew why. And when we were putting the book together, I interviewed Lindy, and I have about 20 or 30 minutes on tape transcribed. And he told me two things. One, he said things stayed calm in Chapel Hill because of Police Chief Bill Blake. Bill Blake, he said, had read Gandhi. And he knew about nonviolent movement. He knew about nonviolent protest and sit-ins and whatnot. And he said that in many cases, when a march was organized, such as the top photograph on the panel on this side, when a march was organized and came down Franklin Street, rather than arrest people for blocking traffic, Bill Blake issued a parade permit. And so there is good reason why Bill Blake's name is on one of the buildings downtown. I will also say that Lindy was quite helpful, and I asked him at one point in the interview, I said, why in the world did you let me where I was to take these photographs? And he said, we knew that you and the staff of the Tar Heel were in contact with the leadership of the movement. We knew that when they went out for a sit-in, that they didn't want the police there first. But they wanted the police there soon. And so they knew that me and some of the other reporters knew where the sit-in was going to be. And he said, quite frankly, I followed you. And in return, I told the officers just to let you do whatever you wanted to so long as you didn't get in their way. Took me almost 50 years to find that out. I also wanted to mention that where you will see lots of women and children. Children under 18, the parents had to sign a permission slip saying that they gave their permission for their son or daughter to be part of the movement and perhaps be arrested, which prevented the leadership of the movement from being charged with contributing to the delinquency of a minor. And I probably knew that I was going to be in a museum sooner or later because I still have one of those blank permission slips with some of the things that I have. I will let it go at that. What I want you to do is take a look at some of these photographs. Remember what James said, that a lot of people think nothing happened during the time 63 and before. All of these did. And be glad to answer any questions, and I will be around for some time afterwards if somebody wants to ask about a particular photograph. One other thing. There's a photograph over there of Karen Johnson being hauled out from Brady's restaurant by one arm. And on the panel next to it, there's a student being carried into the jail by one officer. When Bill Blake saw those photographs in the Tar Heel, he gave orders to his police to always put 2 officers on each person when they arrested them in the future. And so these photographs did make a difference at the time, to some extent.
Great, thanks, Jim. That's great. So I told Lester he can say anything he wants to say.
That being the case, let me begin by saying that I enjoyed my tenure at University of North Carolina, and I wish I had made better use of it, in both in the classroom and otherwise. But I thought it was fun, and it went away much too fast for me. I also want to another biographical note that I hardly ever mentioned. I was born and grew up in Marion, which is somewhere up I-40 West. If you keep driving, you'll find it or something. But that's somewhat relevant to what I'm going to say, because that means that I am a resident of the state of North Carolina, which made it less difficult for me to be turned away if, in fact, anybody wanted to turn me away, and I have no indication that that was the case. But unlike what took place at, well, especially in Mississippi with James Meredith, with the high drama of that, or the less drama with Charlene Hunter at Georgia, yeah. But all of you know this, of course, that there was not that sort of thing here in Chapel Hill at the University of North Carolina. In fact, my main memory of my experience there was that people mostly ignored me. I felt, or if they ignored me, they were, cordial. Well, it was one or the other, and perhaps I would prefer to say they were cordial than they ignored me. I was excuse me, you want to say that? I was when I lived in, I think first dorm I lived in was Avery, and I stayed in Avery for a semester, and later on I moved to Eringhouse, and after that I moved off campus and lived with a black family named Foster. Really, I'm sorry I lost touch with them. They were, they were really good to me. But in Avery and all those dorms in that quad there, and those some of you will remember, they're kind of they're set up as kind of military. There were 4 bunks per group. They were beds really, but for the sake of argument, I'm going to call them bunks. And there were more black students on campus than most people realized at that time. And in that particular dorm, there were at least 6 black undergraduate students. And most of us sort of, kept to ourselves, as students still do in most cases. And Airing House was quite a bit different. Airing House was more of at that time, was luxury housing, you could call it that. And it was set on a hill over there by itself. And that was even before Craig was built, I believe, if you remember. And that was different. And then after that, of course, I moved off campus. But my experience in all of those, that we were pretty much a self-contained group. When I saw the first group last night when I arrived at the barbecue, I'm looking at name tags, and I saw the class of '63, but I didn't see anybody whose name I recognized. Not to mention face, I didn't expect to recognize anyone's face. but I didn't see any names, and I suppose that was something that I wish I had myself done a little better. Not everybody wants to be a friend, but that's part of the problem of race in this country. You don't know what your options would be. Are you being, shall we say, rejected because you're black? Are you being rejected because somebody just doesn't like you? It could be one way or the other. But with black in the equation, it makes it much different to determine which it is. Again, I'm a big basketball fan, and I don't recall ever going to a basketball game here. I should say I don't recall. I never saw a live basketball game here on campus when I was here. I did afterward. But mostly what games I saw was on TV. They were on TV. I don't mean that I was disappointed that I could not join the basketball team. That's not my point. My point is that I didn't do that social endeavor of attending basketball games. Some of you perhaps are doing this, and some of you probably wanted to join or did not join a fraternity or a sorority, and perhaps, I'm not sure of this, perhaps you might regret that today, but that sort of social activity, I wasn't very much of a part of, and I'm reluctant to say that I was rejected on that basis, on the basis of race. I didn't really make a big deal of even going into that situation. I always also thought that, and some of the other students, black students at the time, I also thought, well, there's classroom hostility, not among the students, not vis-a-vis the students, but some of the faculty members seemed to be a bit too harsh, I'll put it that way. But it seemed to me that whenever I ran across a situation one, there was a counterpoint where there was a black student who had had a good experience with that particular faculty member. So it was difficult to say whether this is how widespread this was. As I said, I wish I could go and come back 50, well, let's say 20 years, not 50, that's too far. 20 years and redo it. I would probably enjoy it that much more. The protests while I was here, and again, I came in 1961, and I was here 1961 through 1963. I came in here from what was then North Carolina College, but it's now North Carolina Central University. But when it was a pretty, in terms of protests, there wasn't all that much activity in there. I don't recall ever seeing a large demonstration, either, especially not on campus, but certainly not even downtown. I think perhaps most of it was over but in Chapel Hill. Now, if you wanted to get busy in that situation and that sort of thing, there was a lot going on in Durham. Any Sunday morning, any Saturday, you could find, and that was the sort of thing was happening. You could find a sit-in demonstration or protest movement in Durham. I did some of that, more so than I did here in Chapel Hill. And in fact, I know personally, at least I don't recall, in those years, any restaurant that was segregated. And I don't know that for a fact. I recall one incident, involving me. I don't recall the name of the restaurant, but I recall being thrown out. But I wouldn't call that a classic sit-in, because at the time that I went in with some other people, we weren't sure, at least I was not sure, that what would happen, whether that restaurant was actually segregated. I don't recall the name. I'm not avoiding the name. I just don't recall the name. But when the police came, I said, "Okay, guys, what are we doing?" I said, "Guys," they were gone. But I spent 30 years, almost 30 years, teaching journalism in Florida, and so sometimes I think perhaps the students are having the same attitude toward me as I had when I was here at the University of Florida. I don't want to belabor this. I think I've said too much anyway, so.
Well, let me ask you this then. If I understood you correctly, you're saying that overall, in general, you did not have an experience of unpleasantness as a black student, and that one episode that you mentioned in the restaurant of being thrown out was the only really ugly, if you will, experience that you had during the period here?
I hope I didn't say that.
Yeah. Well,
but it was the ugly, one ugly. But my point was, it wasn't as bad as perhaps it could have been, or it was with some other people. Some of the others, as I said, there were other black students on campus, undergraduate black students, had at least said they had bad experiences, not just in the classroom, but in restaurants and time. As most of you know, the Rathskeller was where most of us spent our time, and I don't think that may not have been segregated when it opened. I don't know. But and of course it stayed open all night, so that was pretty much the only restaurant that we African American students spent a whole lot of time in.
Yeah, and just one other final point. You didn't feel impelled or compelled to be a part of the desegregation movement?
To the extent that there was a desegregation movement in Chapel Hill, it was pretty much non-existent. Insofar as the students were concerned, it was done by mostly involved the people in town. And as I recall, there was not a lot of that going on.
Okay, so let's open it up. Anybody got a question? Yes, ma'am.
I was raised in Washington, D.C. I was at class of 63. And one of the most impressive courses I took here was a history course of African history. And I was very impressed that we had that course because I thought it was about time. And I'm very proud of Chapel Hill for having that course. And I hope they have similar ones to that.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
I don't really have a question. I'm Charles Carson. I'm an interloper here, class of 65. And I was bailed several times during this period, 63, 64. And I want to comment briefly on two things: students, violence, and SNCC. On the subject of students, I want to express my lifelong debt of gratitude to students from Lincoln High School who were the bravest people I've ever met. articulate in expressing the reasons for this movement. On the subject of violence, I was personally witness or near witness to 3 incidents that I would call very violent. One, I was sitting in front of the Cargill sandwich shop when the kid next to me, who was 16 years old and actually from Greenville, Mississippi, was kicked so repeatedly and so hard that when they were taking us into the jail, he collapsed on the steps and had to be taken to the hospital. They picked up his ribs and he came back. And the third incident, second incident was when my friend Luke Calhoun was brought in one night from the Watts Motel where he had been urinated upon, which I would testify by one of that myself. And the third time was when people were brought in from a little store called the Rock Pile, where the owner poured Clorox and ammonia on people, and in fact, it went on for long enough that it went down their throats and they had to be taken to the hospital to have their stomachs pumped out. So that's students and violence. The third is SNCC. The student I mentioned, the kid I mentioned, who was 16 years old, was from SNCC, and there were several other people from SNCC involved. And people from CORE came, but to me, as a soldier in the Army, as we used to say, it was the SNCC people that I looked up to.
Could you stand up again, sir? I don't think everybody understands the Lincoln High School situation here in Chapel Hill. Could you just tell us about that?
I just knew these students as people that I was in jail with.
Right. No, I meant in terms of that this Lincoln High School was the entirely black high school of Chapel Hill, so that the school system in Chapel Hill was absolutely segregated when we were in. And is it not also true that the black high school played football against the white high school?
I don't know that. As I said, I just
It's not true.
knew students in the context of jail, and I knew the guys because they were there with me. I knew the women because I could hear their voices when they sang from the women's side of the jail. So both meant a lot to me and helped keep my spirits up during a rather difficult time.
Thank you so much.
Can I say one?
Yeah.
I just wanted to underline the importance and interest of, it's Charles Thompson, is that right? Comments. Friends sent me material over the years after Jim contacted me about being on the panel, and alumni magazines. There have been several special issues of things like that, and with really good information on the movement in Chapel Hill. And Charles Thompson's writings were some of the most moving and interesting and powerful. And so I think we're honored to have your presence here and to speak.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm also from Section 58, and then I'm was. And then I lived here to 61. So I was here during that time, and I was right next to everything. But what I want to tell you is that I and my little group of friends here were actually friends of Ralph and Leroy. Can't come up with their last names right now. Who were the first enrolled black students here in Carolina. And unfortunately, I'm never informed when and if they come to campus, I want to be there. And, because they'd remember me, because I was pregnant and I was walking around town with them. And that would have been noticeable.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm another broker and wasn't here at the time. What was going through your mind as you made the decision to transfer from North Carolina College to UNC? What did you expect? What kind of support did you get from your family? And was that in any way responsible for just also making the decision to stay down low?
Actually, excuse me, I was looking for a journalism program. That was 12 miles away. And that was by only consideration. I did not expect to encounter any opposition other than a weak transcript from high school to being enrolled. And I sent in the application and I was accepted. If I had not been accepted, I would have sent one someplace else. In fact, I did. I think I sent one to Iowa, University of Iowa. But there was no difficulty, except that I think I had to take a couple of remedial courses. They required me to, and they rejected more of the courses than I thought they would, that I was trying to transfer in. I hope, did I get the entire question?
Well, she was also asking about the kind of support that you got from friends and family coming in here.
I didn't have much of a family at that time. Most of my family was gone. Friends, yeah. Incredulity from some of them who just didn't, why are you doing that? Well, like I said, it was not a protest on my part, or any sort of demonstration to enter the university. The people you mentioned, the other person mentioned, I think their last name was Frazier. And they were from Durham, I think.
Do you have mics for the people who are asking questions?
No.
I can't hear them.
Yeah, no, I don't
We'll
think
try to
about-
repeat the question.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
What I think comes out of it, I was here at that time, and I think what comes out of this, particularly what Lester says, is that there was no single, Chapel Hill was not unified in all of this, but the folks that I would say, the core folks that really mattered, in some respect, it was a good example why Chapel Hill was the perfect place for all of this to be happening. Because we were still a segregated town in the South, but we had the benefit of the university's great leaders within the university, faculty community, and great support. Interestingly enough, among some of the ministerial community, I think that's an interesting part of this. The churches in Chapel Hill broke up at that time because right here on Franklin Street, or on Columbia Street, the Baptist Church turned away a student in the late 50s, and that resulted in the founding of the Big Baptist Church. And you touched on the Rathskeller. My recollection, Jim, is that the Rathskeller, owned by the Danzigers in that time, they had come here, a refugee family from World War II, and if I remember correctly, they were fairly open to all races and colors from the get-go. And Jim, if I recall correctly too, the awful, terrible exceptions to this were the awful people at the Rock Pile and the Watts Motel. And then I see you've got the picture of the colonial drug here, old John Carswell. I mean, he was a card-carrying racist if he ever was. And I think they were exceptions. They were very much exceptions to the rule and kind of an embarrassment to the community. And Jim, do I recall correctly? I think that the Rock Pile folks were arrested after the ammonia incident, I believe, and I think that the Watts Motel folks were arrested by Chief Blake after that. Is that, did anybody?
Excuse me, I think you are correct. I was not here for, frankly, I didn't have a car, and so I wasn't able to get out to Watts Motel. And the Rock Pile incident happened, it was either during one of the holiday breaks or something, and my parents demanded that I come home if they were going to keep paying my tuition. And so, which kept stretching out longer and longer. And so I thought it was interesting. Colonial drug, John Carswell, would allow black folks to come in and buy things they just simply could not stay. And I had one man tell me up at St. Joseph's that if you wanted to get a milkshake, you'd come to the back door. And he said, and it was never quite as big as the one that the white folks got. in front. I smile every time I walk past that building because it's a wine bar now. And one of the things that one of the high school teachers at the high school has done is use the book for some programs to teach students about what happened here. And one student went by and took a picture of Watts and what's there now, and the sit-in outside of Brady's, and what is there now, and you can find it on the web.
I might just say here's a picture of the colonial drug of Jim Wallace's, and it has a young lad in this picture. He's probably 8 or something like that, and he's holding a sign that says 2468, who in the hell wants to integrate? And it's always horrified me in these kinds of stories to see the young people who are doing this.
Yeah.
What you want to say,
I would
Richard?
also like to mention one of the other fully integrated places in Chapel Hill was next to the post office, Harry's.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, Harry's.
most of the Tar Heel staff ate at Harry's.
Right,
In fact, they had a reunion several years later.
right.
And Sybil and Harry came back down from their retirement, and rather than getting a room someplace, we all just met out by the wall. and Harry's was also one of the only places that would let us sign for food as long as we paid up on the end of the month.
Right.
Harry came back to all of us when we were having the reunion, and he'd come up to me and he said, "Don't you still owe me for your
One thing I didn't mention that I think it's appropriate here now, and particularly for those of you from out of state or interlopers, self-described over here, the enormous reputation the university had in the state and in the region, and I think primarily through the person of Frank Graham. And I make that point in part because it had faded some by then. The universities, some of the people who are in John Ely's book, The Free Men, which is the basic primer of the movement here, written very soon afterwards, Pat Cusick, one of the leaders, said he'd come to the conclusion the university very active in the speaker ban in getting it wiped off the books, but they took no active role. Now, it was off campus. It was public accommodation. Again, they didn't get positive. The thing is, it comes through over and over again, is that Chapel Hill wanted to solve this problem voluntarily, and it didn't work. I mean, a quarter of the businesses in Chapel Hill were still segregated in 1964 when the Public Accommodations Act was passed. It wasn't just Carlton's Rock Pile, and it was a quarter of them. At least those are the statistics I've read several places. So there's a gap between the image and the desire and the reality, and that can be fertile for producing tension that creates social change. But there is always that gap there between the image Chapel Hill had of itself and what it was able to deliver, I suppose you'd say, when it came down to it.
I would like to also note that at the Tar Heel, we, as I said, all of these photographs didn't get published, and it was a matter of space. But at no time that I knew of were any of the Tar Heel staff or the editors who were elected by the student body ever called aside by Chancellor Aycock or Dean Long or Bill Friday and asked to hold it down one way or another. And so the university, as far as we were concerned, while they didn't support outwardly what we were doing, they did not try to hinder us in any way.
Richard.
I don't know how many of you may remember, but I went to a Baptist church on the corner, University Baptist, Meeting in the basement with a young minister, Dr. Martin Luther King. There were about 10 of us there. He came to Chapel Hill. We had basically an audience with him for a couple of hours. He was a quiet, not particularly charismatic guy. But within a year or two, of course, the whole world knew who he was. He came to Chapel Hill, I think, because of the reputation here. Talked to him, not many people.
Richard, I tried to find that online, and I went to something in the basement of the University Baptist Church. I think it's in the spring of '60, maybe after he'd been to Raleigh. That's where SNCC is organized at Shaw University in Raleigh in April of 1960, and he may have come back there, but I don't know. I don't know if anybody out there remember. Bob, do you remember it? Right. It was Hill Hall. Maybe he was on campus and spoke several places. Right.
That's right, he was on campus speaking.
Yeah.
He also spent some time up near Carborough, and there is a primarily African-American community center just a block away from St. Joseph's Church. And they have photographs of him at that community center because they had one on every table when we had the reunion dinner a couple months ago.
Joe?
Bob Johnson, who was chaplain at the Western Foundation during this period, gave me permission to tell the story of his, the day.
Stand up, Joe. So
The day of the Watts restaurant experience in which Lou Calhoun was urinated on, he got a call from Charlie Jones, who was the minister of the community church, and said, "We're going to Watts tomorrow. We're going to Watts for breakfast tomorrow." And Bob, may I say, said, "Well, I'm not a pure pacifist here. If Ms. Watts decides to do anything on me, I'm going to take a chair and throw it through the window and get out of here." But they went, along with John Manley, who's an African-American pastor, and they went in the restaurant, and Ms. Watts was out in the front, and there was a sheet between the restaurant and the cooking area where Mr. Watts was. And Ms. Watts said, "Well, Watts, there's a N-word here, and what are we going to do?" And they conferred, apparently, and decided finally to serve these gentlemen. But Bob said that he felt a lot of sadness, really, for this family because this was the end of their life, their whole way of life. They closed soon after because, I mean, there was the social pressure from their clientele that we're not going to show up to keep the place going. So, I mean, we have to be careful not to over-polarize the question of pain that was involved in the whole process.
Thanks.
Yes, sir.
I was part of the civil rights movement in another state, and I won't give its name, down below us. And I've spent my professional career here at Chapel Hill in the School of Medicine as Associate Dean of Student Affairs. On behalf of intellectual realism, I want to say two things. In the late 30s, the NAACP looked around the entire country and asked the question, where is the place that we are most likely to have success in filing for desegregation? And on behalf of a student at North Carolina Central, Thomas Huckett, probably in the late 30s, they filed for his admission to the University of North Carolina here at Chapel Hill. It was not successful. I can't go into the details of it, but Chapel Hill had that image that if anywhere in the country we were going to do it, it was going to be here. Thomas Huckett finished at North Carolina Central and has done some marvelous things elsewhere, represented by several lawyers in Durham. The other thing is that if Rosa Parks is the mother of the civil rights movement, Professor Jeannie Ray McNeil in history here has written a book called Groundwork, and it is on what I coined the godfather of the civil rights movement, Charles Hamilton Houston. Absolutely laid the groundwork to change the Constitution and the jurisprudence of this entire country. So I would, for me, to understand America in the 20th century and the 21st century, it is Charles Hamilton Houston that made all of the legislation and desegregation made it possible. And one of the brilliant minds in the Western world.
Thank you. Did you have anything to say? Yes.
I would like to ask if you recall whether the Carolina Symposium tradition played any positive part in the process of freedom of speech and expression of positions here at Chapel Hill. Because I recall it as being a very positive parallel to the kind of thing you presented this morning.
The question is whether the Carolina Symposium played a role in this whole situation.
My own personal experience, Nelson, was it didn't engage directly with political and racial issues, but it was part of what made the university a special place, and that was outside the classroom, still taking ideas seriously and bringing world-famous people in to enrich further the intellectual and cultural life of the students. So you never know what that kind of openness in one area, how that relates to it in another area. But so I'd see it as a kind of atmospheric influence rather than a direct one.
Of course, one of the great losses of this class is Henry Mayer, who ran the lecture program in our senior year. Henry went on to a very distinguished career as a writer and as a finalist for the National Book Award for his book on William Lloyd Garrison. And one of the people and one of the great moments, in a way, of our Carolina experience was when Malcolm X came to speak here. It was very interesting and sort of personal and vivid for me because you may recall that there had been a plane crash of Atlanta socialites who were on their way to Paris. And it just kind of wiped out a whole strata of high society of Atlanta. That took place right before Malcolm X came here. And Malcolm X was up on the stage of Memorial Hall, and he had his assistants around him who were all very daunting looking. And in the course of what he said, he referred to the Atlanta crash and said it was the chickens coming home to roost. This was so shocking in that audience. And I happened to be standing next to my very, very good friend Barry Moore, who you heard talking about climate change yesterday, I hope. And Barry's from Atlanta. And of course, his family was very emotionally attached to those people who had died in that plane crash. And I turned to Barry and said, do you understand what he's saying? And when B did understand, he started walking down the aisle of Memorial Hall towards the stage. And you could just see Malcolm X's assistants start to move forward by way of protection. But that was a real moment. So the symposium, yes, but also the lecture program was extremely important here. Yes, ma'am.
One thing that hasn't been mentioned that was just before what we're talking about here today was Allard Lowenstein was on campus for several years, and I think, as I look at this, I think he laid the groundwork for many of us who are
I would want to underline the role that I met Al Lowenstein at Ann Queen's house, and I want to underline, somebody mentioned earlier the role of the churches. Charlie Jones at Community College, he'd gotten removed from the Presbyterian Church and started a community church. Earlier, Gib Ruark, one of our classmates, his father in 1949 or 50 was invited by Ruston again, and he stifled or stopped his career advancing in the Methodist Church. But the YMCA and Ann Queen, Bob Johnson at Wesley, Tom Davis in the YMCA. I'm probably leaving out names unjustly, but this was Claude Schatz. But the role of the religious organizations is inestimable in taking us and shaping in different ways attitudes and ideas, but also in playing a kind of activist role in this. They were present and accounted for.
Yes, Al Lowenstein was a very important figure to all of us who were really active with what was going on. Well, one of my regrets about the last 2 days here is that we really haven't focused at all on the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was a huge moment for us in October of 1962. And I remember as vividly as anything that I remember about my experience here was the debate in Carroll Hall that Al Lowenstein presided over when the Cuban Missile Crisis was coming to its penultimate moment, and whether or not President Kennedy should be strong and confront this or allow this to happen. I happened to go to a seminar in the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington with Graham Allison, who is the real scholar on the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he handed out a flyer that said that from his research within the Kennedy administration, probably between JFK and Bobby Kennedy, they had thought that there was a 1/3 to 1/2 chance that there would be thermonuclear war. And as a soccer player, I was out there on Fetzer Field, and I remember very well the contrails of the jets going south for the invasion of Cuba. And in our little circle, there was a lot of talk about whether we were going to die in another 4 days as virgins.
What a fate to behold.
Yes.
The interesting thing to me is that we talk about freedom of speech and the speaker ban law and so forth, and yet 2 or 3 years ago I was pretty distressed to read in one of the magazines, the school issue magazines, that we have not that freedom to let people that have different persuasions to speak. When one of the right-wingers came to speak on campus and he was not allowed to speak. And so we have to be a little bit careful about saying, we're so open and so broad-minded that we still do have the tendency to not let people speak on campus.
Yes, sir.
I'm 1963 J School grad, and let me tell you, Lester is being too kind about what happened with him here. It really is. And, there were things maybe he didn't know about, but there were things, Lester, let me assure you.
Okay, you did.
Okay.
We didn't have the sophisticated public opinion polls in those days that we have now, but I think it would be a fair statement, and I invite others who were here to chime in, to say student opinion was pretty much equally divided. Students reflected their parents' sentiments and their but this was reflected in a vote vice president of the student body was automatically the speaker of the student legislature. He was absent that night. And the speaker pro tem broke the tie in favor of the resolution. I was the speaker pro tem.
Yeah. Go ahead, sir. Go ahead.
Unlike my esteemed friend Charles, I was not a soldier in the Army, but I was standing on the sideline writing stories. And Wayne King, I'm so glad Jim mentioned Wayne King, who sadly cannot be with us today. A great reporter for 25 years with the New York Times, but just an extraordinary man. But one day, one of his friends was picketing down, it was either the Tar Heel Sandwich Shop or the college cafe, campus cafe, college cafe. And they had to go lunch or go take a test or something, so Wayne filled in for him. And he was carrying the sign, and one of the local rednecks started harassing him. Wayne put down the sign, grabbed him by the throat, and said, "You gotta understand, I'm not nonviolent."
Yes.
My husband is not here, but in the class of 63, on his behalf, I would like to thank Mr. Lester, because he conducted himself as a good Christian, and he spoke very quietly in let bygone be bygone. But I do know that Mr. Lester did say a lot, and he chose not to say it, and that's the way we should take it. We should move on. We are united now. Let's stay that way. Thank you, Mr. Lester.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Tom.
I appreciate very much this historical perspective, but we're now on the in the waning moments of this debacle with the African American Studies program. And I mentioned in the future of that aspect of this university, it appears to me that perhaps lessons were not learned in 55 years since 1959. The situation is, and I think athletics has done as much as law in many respects to integrate many of our institutions, including this institution. I never knew Mr. Carson. I am colorblind. Hope I was colorblind then, but I don't recall ever seeing him. But the complexion of this university has changed dramatically, and I think for a very good reason and thing for the future of the university. But what I'm concerned about, the matter of student athletes, that's medicinal in many cases, is athlete students. Many come here terribly disadvantaged academically because of the failings in many instances of the public school system. And I'm very keen on what this university is going to do to improve the circumstances of the athlete students who come here. Many, as we know, are only here for a year or two before they go on, hopefully, to bigger and better things. But we need to arm them as much as possible while they are here, while they're in our care, with the skill sets that they're going to need when they no longer have the athletic skills that catapult them into programs. That's what I'm interested in as far as this university is concerned going forward. Do everything we can to help our disadvantaged.
Here, here.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Some of us have been counting how many times I've raised my hand. So I'm glad to speak to you, and it's just a follow-up on Ann Queen. I know a number of you, like myself, feel that we've got our real education at Ann's feet, in her living room, drinking her tea, talking to Paul Phillip, talking with the most amazing people from all over the world, major civil rights leaders. And she was a person who always sought to make peace and who sought to reconcile different factions during the civil rights movement here. And I know the why goes on and is a useful part of the campus, but I think the role that she played at that time probably touched most of the people in this room. And I'd love to see us find a way to do a special honor she would just listen to us until we figured out what we needed to do, the education.
I might just add to that Anne Queen was given an honorary degree at UNC, we all thought very, very belatedly. Honorary degrees are often given for monetary reasons and not nearly enough for the kind of humanitarian work that she did and the enormous influence that she had on a number of us. I think we'll have to leave it at